This video is being made June 5th, 2017, a day before the Pokemon Direct announces whatever it is that they're going to announce. So I do not know right now, as it stands right now, what the game is. I have my predictions, and that's exactly why you clicked on this video. But if it ends up being something else, I don't need 4 million comments talking about, oh, actually, it was a fucking Magikarp Jump 2. I don't care. This is what I'm here to talk about, what I think it's going to be tomorrow and why I think it's going to be tomorrow. And also, I'm really mad because I really wanted to make this video very professional, very well edited, and they just decided to drop a direct on us fucking tomorrow with me only having half of a script done and like a month of research under my belt. So I have to cram all that into this video right now. Also, I'm going to get through this information as quickly as I can. I kind of hurt my back yesterday and it really hurts to sit, but I really need to record this. So I'm gonna go as fast as possible, get out of the way so I can go lay down, because this really hurts. One more thing is that some of the stuff I say in this video might feel like a stretch, and who knows, maybe it is a stretch, but I felt like it was worth mentioning. If I feel like it's worth mentioning, then I'm gonna mention it, regardless of whether it feels a little bit like a stretch or not, because who knows, even little points can help add up to a big point, whatever. So yeah, if you click this video, then you obviously want to hear about why I think they're going to be Diamond and Pearl remakes announced tomorrow, and not some other stuff like Pokemon on the Switch, or Pokken, or a sequel to Sun and Moon. I'm not going to spend any time debunking those other ideas. I'm just going to present the evidence for my idea and hope that you can see things in the same light that I see things. And I'm going to do my best to try to break all this up into different sections, like in-game evidence and anime evidence and real-world evidence and symbolism and mythology and all that crap, and then game mechanics and sales and blah 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 blah. So let's just go ahead and start with in-game evidence. Now, obviously, our first bit of evidence is the event Munchlax that we got at the beginning of Sun and Moon's release, which is very similar to the Torchic that we got at the beginning of X and Y's release, with a Torchic that could Mega Evolve, which we then got Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, in which all the Hoenn starters could Mega Evolve, and that was very clearly a little hint to what was to come. So this event Munchlax being a Gen 4 Pokemon, obviously, is a pretty big hint as to Diamond and Pearl remakes possibly coming, whether they're announced tomorrow or whether they're announced later on. I think that might be a hint toward it, because that's such a weird Pokemon to choose. Next is the fact that in the Dimensional Research Lab on the shelves are a couple of books or notes or whatever that mention Palkia, Giratina, and Bronzong, talking about their ability to create portals to other dimensions and all this other stuff. It seems really weird that there even is a focus on like dimensions and stuff this generation, since, you know, Diamond and Pearl was all about dimensions, the dimensions of time and space and the distortion world and all that other stuff, and traveling interdimensionally. It's weird that they brought it back this gen for whatever reason and referenced those Pokemon in the Dimensional Research Lab. Speaking of labs, in the labs under the Aether Paradise, it's mentioned that Team Aether traveled to Kanalave City Library to collect materials for the development of the RKS system, which, as we know, is Silvally. And Silvally is super similar to Arceus in the fact that its ability is RKS system. RKS, Arceus, like, it's there. Also, Silvally is a quadrupedal crested normal type that changes type with its items and even changes the type of its signature attack, which is exactly like Arceus. And RKS system, when translated in other language, is the AR system, like Arceus, and the Alpha system, with Arceus being the Alpha Pokemon. Next up is the fact that all of the key items from Diamond and Pearl are left over in the code for Sun and Moon. Like everything down from the Explorer Kit to the Pal Pad, which I don't even think we would need anymore. Why is it in there? I don't know. Maybe it's placeholder data or something. I don't know. It's weird that they put all the key items from Diamond and Pearl in Sun and Moon. So I think that it may be because they're developing remakes for, you know. Next up is the fact that the Pokedex in Sun and Moon is a Rotom. Why now are we giving such attention to Rotom, especially like in a new form? I'll talk more about the Rotom Dex later and how that could tie into Diamond and Pearl remakes. Next up is that Sun and Moon don't really feature very many Generation 4 Pokemon. Now, whenever a generation is going to feature a remake, what they try to do is not include very many Pokemon from the games that are going to be remade, so that it's a little more exciting when you encounter these Pokemon again. Now, in some instances, they didn't do a very good job of this, like from X and Y to Oras. There was a lot of Gen 3 Pokemon in X and Y, which made Oras a little less exciting than it could have been. But in Sun and Moon, there are only 15 Generation 4 Pokemon. That's 15 Generation 4 Pokemon that aren't tied to any other Pokemon from any generation through evolution. That being a total of 29 Pokemon if you count those in. But still, that's only 29 Pokemon out of 302 Pokemon in the Alola Pokedex, which is crazy. So really, that's only 15 Pokemon out of 29 Pokemon out of 302. It seems really deliberate that they haven't put very many Generation 4 Pokemon in Sun and Moon, and I think that's going to be because they're remaking Diamond and Pearl. Next up, we're going to take a look at Melee Island. Now, all the islands in Alola are based on real islands from Hawaii, and Melee is based on the island of Oahu. And with these two landmarks matching up to actual landmarks in Oahu, there's this harbor and this mountain. And of course, we know that these are Pearl Harbor and Diamond Head Mountain that these locations are based on. Pearl Harbor and Diamond Head Mountain. I don't think that that's a coincidence that they chose to add these landmarks specifically into their game with whatever new names that they have for them. This next one's a bit of a stretch, but I really wanted to mention it because it kind of works. So the Team Skull Grunts, male and female, have blue and pink hair respectively. And as you know, blue and pink were like the colors of Generation 4, especially with the legendaries. Now again, that may seem like a bit of a stretch, but they could have chosen any hair color for these guys, like anything. They could have had a uniform color like, I don't know, every other evil team. Every other evil team has their grunts with the same hair color, no matter the gender. And this is the first time that they chose the grunts and they said, you know what, these ones get blue hair and these ones get pink hair. Why? So in that sense, the male grunts could match up to Dialga, and the female grunts could match up to Palkia. Now, where does that leave the other legendaries from Gen 4? So Gladion's overall look with the blonde hair and the black and red clothes makes me think that it's supposed to represent Giratina, and their backstories even kind of match up a little bit. Gladion is dark and brooding and kind of sinister and cold, and in a sense he was kind of cast out by Aether. Granted, he left on his own, but he left on his own because he was kind of being neglected, and the fact that they were neglecting Type Null. So really, it kind of feels like he was cast out by them, and then he chose to leave. Kind of like Giratina was cast out by Arceus to the Distortion World. Now, I'm not really sure where that leaves Guzma and Plumeria, but I kind of think that they might be reminiscent of Darkrai and Cresselia. Guzma, based purely on appearance with his white hair and black attire, it kind of looks like Darkrai, but with Plumeria, it's kind of a little deeper. So she has pink and yellow hair, which is obviously a lot like Cresselia, but Plumeria gets her name from the Plumeria flower, which is this weird kind of flower that only blooms at night, aka while the moon is out, and Cresselia is obviously very moon related, so it seems a little weird that the only female legendary who is pink and yellow and associated with the moon, there's also a pink and yellow haired female named after the flower that only blooms pretty much while the moon is out. So you can kind of see that. In that sense, Aether would kind of represent Arceus with their white and yellow attire, and also their ties to Silvally, which is obviously supposed to be Arceus 2.0. Moving on, I want to talk about how the generations since Generation 5 have been a mirror to Gens 1 through 4, like almost to a T. It's really scary. So Gen 5 was supposed to feel like a sort of soft reboot and a mirror to Generation 1, and they did a really good job of that with their set of starters, with the fire type being the only type to change its type since the beginning. So like Bulbasaur stays grass and poison as it evolves, Squirtle stays water as it evolves, but Charmander eventually becomes fire flying. Just like Snivy stays grass throughout its evolutions, Oshawott stays water throughout its evolutions, and Tepig changes from a fire to a fire fighting type as it evolves. Team Plasma is important, but you won't see the similarities until we move on to Black and White 2. But it is worth mentioning that their Elite Four also has two trainers that are a fighting type trainer and a ghost type trainer, which is just like Bruno and Agatha from the Gen 1 Elite Four. So now we move on to Black and White 2, which has you pretty much in the same area, but over to the west. Just like in Generation 2, you're in the region over to the west, and in both games you eventually make it back to where you were in the first games. Black and White 2 also features Team Plasma, which are now reformed after the first games, after their leader left. Just like in Generation 2, Team Rocket is reformed after Giovanni has left. Your rivals in both Generation 2 2 and Black 2 and White 2, Silver and Hue, they both hate the evil organizations of their games for very personal reasons. And finally, you move on to the Elite Four, which obviously is the same in Black 2, White 2 as it was in Black and White, but the other two trainers are a Dark type trainer and a Psychic type trainer, just like Will and Karen from the Gen 2 Elite Four. And not to mention, the champion in Black 2, White 2 is a Dragon type trainer from the first games, just like in Generation 2. In Gen 2, we have Lance, who we saw in Generation 1 and is a Dragon type trainer, and in Black 2, White 2, we have Iris as the champion, who was the Dragon type gym leader in at least Pokemon Black anyway, or was it White? I don't remember. Then comes along X and Y, which does a really good job of mirroring Generation 3, and then Generation 3 was remade in that generation. X and Y features 3 legendaries, a blue, a red, and a green, who is serpent-like, who never leave the region and have a tendency to lay dormant. The blue and the red are always in conflict, and it's always solved by the green serpentine legendary, which is exactly like Generation 3 with Kyogre, Groudon, and Rayquaza. Groudon and Kyogre are always fighting, and Rayquaza stops it. There are actually a bunch of little similarities between X and Y and Generation 3 that are actually kind of mind-blowing. So in both games, you have a central city that features an electric-type gym leader. To the west of that city, you have a route that features the daycare center, and if you head west on that route, you'll hit a cave where you can find Whismur, and then if you head through that cave to the other side, you'll eventually find the town that features a rock-type gym leader. In both games, the 7th gym leader is a Psychic-type specialist, and in both games, after you beat that gym leader, comes the climax of the story arc with the regional evil team, and you can't progress on until you beat that team. And in both games, later in the post-game, you can go find the 3rd green serpentine legendary, catch a couple flying roaming legendaries just like Latios and Latias and the legendary birds. And in both games, you receive the beginning stage of the Champion's Ace Pokemon. In X and Y, you get Ralts, and in Ruby and Sapphire, you get Beldum. So with that pattern in mind, you would think that Generation 7 and Sun and Moon would have a lot of similarities to Diamond and Pearl, which obviously they do. So it seems pretty likely that we could get some remakes. Speaking of similarities between the games, it's worth mentioning that both generations feature a brand new Pokemon who is completely useless if you catch a male. Generation 4 has Combee, which does not evolve if it's a male, but does evolve if it's a female, just like Generation 7 has Salandit, who will evolve if female, but does not evolve if male. Both games also feature their place for breeding Pokemon in a ranch town. Next up is the fact that Cynthia in the battle tree exactly quotes her text from Diamond and Pearl. She is the only character to do that except for Red, but all Red says is ... He doesn't even say anything, so of course he's just gonna say ... with his feature in Sun and Moon. And speaking of Cynthia, she gets her name from the Greek goddess Artemis. Artemis was sometimes called Cynthia because of her birthplace on Mount Cynthus, but Artemis is the goddess of the moon. And if you think about it, Cyrus is kind of like the opposite of Cynthia, because Cynthia is good and a very important character, and Cyrus is very, very bad and a very important character. Now, Cyrus gets his name from the Persian word kuros, which means sun, moon, and sun and moon. Finally, the last bit of in-game evidence is the 3 orbs for the Sinnoh legendaries that we find in Zygarde's cave in X and Y. It seems a little weird that they would place those items there, only for Zygarde not to really get any attention in Generation 6, but then get its full attention in Generation 7. So maybe that's a way of hinting that the legendaries tied to those orbs are also going to get a very big spotlight in Generation 7 with remakes. Next up, I want to talk about the anime. So Generation 5 was supposed to be a mirror to Generation 1, and the anime does the same thing as the games. The Black and White series of the anime does a really good job of mirroring the Generation 1 series of the anime. In the Gen 5 anime, Ash has all 3 starters, but only evolves the Fire-type starter, which is exactly like Generation 1 when he has all 3, but he only evolves Charmander. Now granted, he does evolve Charmander all the way until he's a Charizard, and Tepig only until it's a Pignite, but the similarity is definitely there. Also keep in mind that both of his companions are technically gym leaders, although Iris isn't a gym leader in the anime, I think, but she is a gym leader in the games. Iris is also always bickering with Ash, and Silent, being a gym leader, is very knowledgeable in Pokemon just like Brock was, and is also the designated cook for them. So they're doing a really good job of mirroring Misty and Brock. Okay, maybe it's not really good, it was kind of really bad, but you know what I mean. Now, I couldn't really find any similarities between the Black 2, White 2 era of the anime in Generation 2, but I'm sure that some of the symbolism is there. Just the problem is I haven't watched the Generation 2 anime in a long time, so obviously I'm not going to remember anything and make connections, but, you know, I'm sure they're there. Move on to the X and Y anime, which is supposed to mirror the Generation 3 anime, and again, they do a really good job. Ash only has one starter, just like he does in Generation 3. He's also joined by 3 companions, a gym leader again, and then an older and a younger sibling. The younger sibling also struggles with the fact that they're too young to be a Pokemon trainer. So obviously Serena, Clement, and Bonnie are supposed to mirror Brock, May, and Max, even though Clement is both the gym leader and the older sibling, but the similarities are still there, obviously. So now we move on to the Sun and Moon anime, which obviously isn't finished and really has barely started in the US, but what we do know is that Ash has 2 starters, the Fire and the Grass, and that most likely he's probably going to evolve both of them. Ash also may have a lot of companions in Sun and Moon and doesn't really travel as much as he's like learning about Pokemon, but he does have a blue-haired companion friend, girl, lady, whatever, who has the water type starter of that region, being Poplio. And again, this is just like the Sinnoh anime, where Ash has 2 starters, the Fire and the Grass, and evolves both of them, and his blue-haired companion, aka Dawn, has the water starter of that region, being Piplup. Now this very last part isn't really anime per se, but it is video related, so I figured I'd just throw it in here. Now in November sometime last year, the Pokemon company from Japan decided to put a video on their YouTube channel of like a storybook or something being read that features Gen 4 Pokemon, and like only Gen 4 Pokemon. It features all 3 of the starters and a Bidoof and a Munchlax and a couple other Pokemon, and I'm pretty sure they're all Gen 4 Pokemon, which was really weird because that's all in the midst of Sun and Moon just being released. So why randomly throw in this little storybook video of the Gen 4 starters? I don't know what that's all about. Why did they choose to do that? I think maybe it's a hint. So now that's the anime out of the way. Now I kind of want to move into the mythology, you know, stuff like that, you know, the hippy dippy stuff that is, it does match up, but it is very hippy dippy. Now obviously Loxton has talked a lot more about this in his gigantic reset theory from last year about like numerology and the language of flowers and things like that. So I'm not really going to be able to get into all of that because there's a lot. If you really want to know about all that stuff, I would go watch those playlists, especially part 3. Not 2.5, part 3. Go find part 3. It's got like Arceus on the thumbnail. Watch that one specifically, but if you want more context, to watch all the videos before that. But he goes into some really deep stuff about like numerology and Greek mythology and Norse mythology and Hindu mythology and alchemy and all this other stuff. All this stuff that has tied into Pokemon very subtly over the course of the last, well, I don't know, like over a decade? Well over a decade, actually. And you'll learn more. I can't cover everything here, so I'm just going to cover a few things. So we're going to start off with a little bit of numerology. Now, numerology is like this idea that numbers represent something, and obviously it can be different throughout different belief systems and different areas of the world. I think what I'm going off of is kind of like Western, sort of Christian-based numerology. I didn't really check to see what kind it was, but obviously this is one instance of these ideas in numerology. Now, Sun and Moon are the 11th installment to the main series, if you include all the remakes. These are the 11th games. And in numerology, 11 symbolizes the potential to push the limitations of the human experience into the stratosphere and of the highest spiritual perception. It also represents the link between the mortal and the immortal, man and spirit, and light and dark, and ignorance and enlightenment. Now, if you've watched Loxton's videos, you know that you know that Sun and Moon are very representative of this link between man and God, mortal and immortal, light and dark. It's about tying all those things together. Now, Sun and Moon really fits this to a T because it really pushes the limitations of what we know a Pokemon game to be. There's no gyms, there's no HMs, there's 2 evil teams. and so on. So it really seems like Sun and Moon is fitting this 11th number in numerology pretty much to a T. Now if we move one step up to the number 12, 12 is the number of completion. So if Diamond and Pearl remakes were to be made, they would be the 12th installment of the series, kind of completing the whole series altogether before we move on to the land of the home consoles and the Switch and all that stuff. Now we'll get into why that's significant later, but for now I want to move on to some biblical stuff. Now this one's going to be a little bit of a stretch near the end, but trust me, it does kind of line up pretty well. So in the Bible, there is the book of Genesis, which is the story of God making literally everything, like the universe and our world and us and life and everything. So in the book of Genesis, God spends 7 days creating everything. 7 days, 7 generations, and they all actually kind of match up pretty well, except for like a couple, but don't worry, I'll explain. So on the first day, God creates the heavens and the earth with only water, which is essentially like the building blocks of everything, the starting point. Just like generation 1 was the starting point of everything. On day 2, God creates the separation between the sea and the sky. Now that kind of matches up to generation 2 with the sea and the sky being separated, and the sea with Lugia and the sky with Ho-Oh. On day 3, God creates the land and the continents, thus forming actual seas and not just being a planet covered in water. Again, that's day 3, God creates the land and the continents and thus creating seas, actual seas. Land and continents, Groudon, seas, Kyogre. Day 3, Gen 3. On day 4, God creates the stars and the heavenly bodies, i.e. space, and these heavenly bodies are decreed to be used by man to tell time. Again, day 4, God creates space for man to be able to tell time. Space and time. Heavenly bodies, sun and moon, but space and time, Gen 4, the matchup, the sun and moon thing, obviously. Very good hint, because the sun and moon were used to tell time back in the day. Here's where it starts to be kind of a stretch, but hear me out. On day 5, God creates the first life in the sea and the sky, and flying bugs for some reason. Now this doesn't really match up to Gen 5, but if you consider that Gen 5 is supposed to be a reboot of Generation 1, then if we go back to Generation 1, Genesis also mentions that God creates the separation between light and darkness and calls them day and night. Light and dark, white, black, black and white, Gen 5, Gen 1, Day 5, Day 1. You see that connection. Day 5 also matches up with Gen 2 and thus Day 2 because God creates life in the sea and the sky, just like how in Day 2 he creates the separation between the sea and the sky. So again, sea and sky, Lugia, Ho-Oh, Black 2 and White 2 were mirrors of Generation 2. There you go. On day 6, God creates the life on the land, followed by men. So on day 6, God creates life on the land, which essentially separates life on the land and life on the sea. Life on the land, life on the sea. Land, sea, Groudon, Kyogre, Gen 3, Day 3, they kind of match up again. And finally, we get to Day 7. Now, Day 7 is called the Day of Rest, which is the day that God said, all right, dude, I'm done. Everything's good. You're good. This is the day that you guys will just, I don't know, worship me or whatever. And that day eventually becomes Sunday. Sunday, by the way. Sunday, which is followed by Monday, Moon Day, Monday, Moon Day. That's where it gets the name from. And Sunday is the day that is set aside by religious peoples to get more connected with God. It's the day that they set aside for God. So the 7th day of the week is for getting connected to the God, just as Generation 7 has a lot of hints of man becoming connected to the gods, the mortal and the immortal. Now again, some of that may seem like a stretch, but now we're going to get into kind of why Diamond and Pearl remakes would work. This doesn't really count as evidence, although it could be considered evidence, but it's not really like, oh, this links with this, so this could work. We're going to talk about why Diamond and Pearl remakes would be the best thing and why they would work and how they would work and blah blah blah. Okay, so now we're going to go back to the Rotom decks. And again, it seems weird that Rotom is getting such attention in Sun and Moon. Now, I think that may be because they're planning to do a Rotom Pokétch in Diamond and Pearl remakes. I know it just seems like a cool idea on the surface, but not with a whole lot of backing, but take into account that whenever they do a remake within a generation, they always try to improve the bottom screen. Diamond and Pearl had the Pokétch, and then with Heart Gold and Soul Silver, they kind of got rid of that, but they put the full menu on the bottom screen, so you didn't really have to hit a start button as much as you just had to tap the bottom screen, which was obviously a very big improvement. Now, Black and White kind of reversed this since the bottom screen, in my opinion, was a little bit useless and kind of boring, and Black 2 White 2 didn't really do much to fix it, but at least it did have internet connectivity right there that you could access, which is obviously a very big improvement. Moving on to X and Y, the bottom screen had 3 features, which is obviously the PSS, Pokemon and Me, and the Super Training, and then you could access all your menus with little buttons at the bottom. Now, when they remade Generation 3, they kept all that stuff, but then they added even more with a Dex Nav and a minimap and all this other stuff, all within the bottom screen, which is, again, a very big improvement to Generation 6's X and Y's bottom screen. So now we have Generation 7 with the Rotom Dex on the bottom, which doesn't really do much but talk to you and display a mini-map. To access your start menu, you actually just have to hit Y and then access your stuff like that. The Rotom Pokétch has barely anything to do with that. So if they were going to remake Diamond and Pearl, then a Rotom Pokétch would be the way to go. The Rotom Pokétch would talk to you, you could flip through different apps, some of those apps being your party Pokemon, and obviously you can still access everything with a start button, but if they were to improve Rotom being on the bottom screen, then what better way than for Rotom to be more than just a mini-map and to have multiple apps just like the Pokétch did. But that's just an in-game mechanic. Let's talk about how the games would work on the system as a whole. Now, obviously the DS family of handhelds is kind of on its last leg, since we're about to kind of make the transition into the Nintendo Switch, which is obviously a handheld and a console in one. Now, the Nintendo Switch is pretty new and not very many people have it just yet. So realistically, it would make sense for them to remake the first games that they made for the DS family as the last thing on the DS family, all before we finally make the full transition to the Switch. Now, obviously Nintendo has said that the Switch isn't supposed to replace the 3DS family, but keep in mind that's also the same thing that they said about the Nintendo DS and the Game Boy Advance. It wasn't supposed to replace it, but it eventually did replace it. One reason that I've heard that people think Diamond and Pearl won't be remade on the DS family is because Diamond and Pearl are still playable on the current hardware. Now, you have to keep in mind that the remakes of previous Pokemon games didn't start because stuff wasn't playable on current hardware. The big problem was that they weren't able to figure out how to transfer Pokemon from old games to the Generation 3 games. That's why Red and Green were remade for the Game Boy Advance, not because they weren't playable on it. In fact, they are still playable on it. You can take a copy of Red or Green and plug it into a Game Boy Advance and be able to play it. It wasn't because it wasn't playable, but because the Pokemon weren't transferable. So just because Diamond and Pearl are still playable on the 3DS family doesn't mean that they can't be remade for the DS family. Now, again, some people think that we're going to be getting these games on the Nintendo Switch, but I feel like it might be a little bit too early. Not very many people have a Nintendo Switch just yet, and Game Freak really likes to wait it out until they feel like a lot of people have the console that they're making the games for so that they can make money. X and Y weren't released for the Nintendo 3DS until like 2 years after the Nintendo 3DS had already launched. And Pokemon Black 2 and White 2 were released a year to the day after the Nintendo 3DS had already launched. So it's still possible for them to make a game on one system, even though a newer system has already come out. Now, I'm definitely saving the best for last here, because this is something that blew my goddamn mind. Holy shit. So as it stands right now, Sinnoh and Johto are the 2 regions, not games, regions, that are the hardest to get their Pokemon to the current games, Sun and Moon. Everything else has direct and or near direct access to Pokemon Bank and thus to Sun and Moon. X, Y, and Oras have direct access to Sun and Moon. Black, White, Black 2, and White 2 have the Pokemon Transfer, which then goes to Pokemon Bank and then to Sun and Moon. And then Sun and Moon obviously has its own region, which you don't even need to access Pokemon Bank to get those into Sun and Moon. And even Kanto, with the red, blue, yellow releases on the Virtual Console, have access to Pokemon Bank, and thus it's easy to get Pokemon from Kanto into Sun and Moon. Sinnoh and Johto are the only 2 regions where it is the hardest to get them into there. You have to get them from Diamond, Pearl, Platinum, Heart Gold, and Soul Silver, transferred to Black and White, Black 2, White 2, and then into Pokemon Bank, and then into Sun and Moon. So if they were to do a Sinnoh remake alongside a Johto Virtual Console release, which is another thing that people have been talking about, is that they're going to do Gold, Silver, Crystal on the Virtual Console for the 3DS. If they do Sinnoh remakes that have access to Pokemon Bank, and then Gold, Silver, Crystal Virtual Console releases that have access to Pokemon Bank, then every single region would have access to Pokemon Bank and thus to Sun and Moon, meaning that finally it'll actually all come together in Pokemon Sun and Pokemon Moon, just like the trailer that they used to reveal Sun and Moon. It all comes together. Every region finally united into one, accessible into the newest generation before the rebirth of the series, just like Loxton talks about in his videos, before we move to the Switch. It all comes together. That's why they played all the footage from different games when they said it all comes together in Pokemon Sun and Pokemon Moon. Whenever they did the trailer, they played footage from every game because every game is now going to have access to Generation 7. Whew, that one gets me really excited. Also, it's really hot in here. So that's why I think that tomorrow they're going to reveal Diamond and Pearl remakes. However, if they don't, there is still hope. I have no doubt in my mind that Game Freak is going to remake Diamond and Pearl at some point. And even if all the evidence that I've pointed out here today doesn't match up, I still think it's going to happen at some point. So if it doesn't happen tomorrow, it could happen in the future, and here's why. If tomorrow isn't Diamond and Pearl remakes being announced, keep in mind that the guy who leaked the Switch as a dockable tablet with detachable controllers, which is exactly what it was, and who leaked the Mario X Rabbids game, which is now a thing, and a lot of people think it's really fucking weird, is also the same guy that leaked Pokemon Stars as the code name for the new game, meaning that he is very credible, so we should take Pokemon Stars at face value, that is definitely the code name and or the name of the games. Now recently in Japan there was a release of some merch called Look Upon the Stars, which is just a couple of posters and I think some plushes and stuff, but on one of the posters there is a bunch of constellations represented by Pokemon that are actual real constellations in our actual sky. But the most important part of that is that these are some of the same constellations that you see in the end credits of Pokemon Channel and of Jirachi Wishmaker, which both aired on July 18th and 19th respectively in 2003. In this case, I think the Jirachi Wishmaker date of July 19th is the most likely. My prediction is that if tomorrow isn't Diamond and Pearl remakes being announced, then my prediction is that they will be announced on July 19th, 2017, which is a Wednesday, which gets its name from Odin, Odin's Day, Wednesday, Woden's Day, that's where it comes from, and there's a lot of Norse mythology that plays into all this stuff, blah, 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 blah. July 19th, 2017, or even just July 19th, 2018, because that would make it like 12 years after the Diamond and Pearl were, you know, whatever. And that the games will release on September 28th, 2017, and or 2018 or 19, because Diamond and Pearl released on September 28th, like 2006 or something like that. So it's like 11 or 12 years or so since those came out, and you know, they wait like a decade or so before they remake games. Anyway, that's all I have. My back really hurts. It's really, really hot. If any of this kind of blew your mind or you kind of agree with me at all, then please leave a like. It'd be super cool. I'm sorry that this can't be edited super nice like I wanted it to be, and that it feels really ranty and very unprofessional, but I wanted to get this information out there if they do reveal Diamond and Pearl remakes. I would rather have a video out where I'm revealing the information and it's not up to like my standards of quality, but at least I got the video out, so rather than not get the video out and all this research that I've done go to waste and it be a waste of my time and me have to live with the fact that I predicted another game and I didn't have time to do the video, because that's what happened with Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire. I spent like a month doing research as to why X and Y had all these hints to Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire coming out, and then they announced Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire before I could make a video, and I was very mad, so I'm doing this now. So yeah, leave a like, blah, blah, blah. Videos will come whenever. Stay bueno.